Morning, everyone. So I'm going to give you a very quick 15-minute rundown of the realities of the streaming world from the independent labels perspective. So for those of you who don't know, very briefly, Merlin is the global rights agency for the independent sector. We represent almost 850 members from 53 countries around the world, and we license their music onto streaming platforms. Merlin is 9 and a little bit years old, and we announced a month ago that we've now paid out $1 billion in streaming revenues to our members in that time, almost 400 of that in the last 12 months alone. Really the purpose of today is to take what we all talk about as the potential of the market and try and put some actual figures around it to give you a sense of what it means. So we start with this, which is always I think the best illustration of the realities of the growth and the pace of growth of the streaming market. This chart shows audio streaming only. This doesn't include any video streaming, and shows you that between January 14 and May of this year, we've gone from paying out just under $10 million a month to our members to just about $35 million. Extraordinary rates of growth, which is being driven by a whole bunch of factors that we'll see. The reality is, in the streaming space, independents are competing in a way that we've never really enjoyed in the market before. Our market share, our share of the listenership on streaming services is far beyond what we ever saw in the physical market or the download market. And the main reason for that is that consumers, wherever they are in the world now, have access to all of the music everywhere, all of the time, increasingly curated to them in ways that are totally different to the traditional channels of the music industry, where radio, television, press and retail ruled the roost. To look at this in a different way, this is our annual revenues based on a 12-month basis going back from 2012-13 to the last 2 years. And as you can see, our yearly revenues have increased eightfold in that time. And we firmly believe, and from analysing these figures against the industry figures that we see released by the IFPI and the RIAA, that independents are actually growing faster in the streaming space. And part of that is because independents have got, our sector is driven by real entrepreneurs, people who are facing the future, looking for the advantages they can get, and really taking advantages of all of these opportunities that the streaming services bring. You have a global audience. There's no channels limiting how those consumers can come to you. And the labels in our world that are succeeding are the labels that have embraced that early, are building their businesses around it, are starting to control how they interact with the digital space, tying in their social media activity with their consumption activity, with their playlisting activity, and clearly are benefiting hugely from not only the growth of this business in major markets, but in other markets. But clearly this is a global picture, and we're within a very particular region here. So we've broken out some figures to try and give you an idea of what's happening in the Asian markets, which are much, much later entrants, at least on a global basis, into the audio streaming space. And here you can see the growth pattern from the same period, from January 14 to May 17. Again, these are month-on-month revenues, is following very much the same pattern that we're seeing everywhere in the world. The availability of these services and the ubiquity of music in these markets that's being brought by, Deezer and KKBox and Spotify and the other, the other services that are operating in this market, with Apple Music coming in now, is really engaging consumers at a level, far beyond, I think, what we expected, and in some ways mirrors what we've seen in other emerging markets. And to break this down into how Asia is performing against how we're seeing the global markets perform, the chart on the left shows you the May 17 versus May 16 growth in the Asian regions on the left, which is almost double, to our global growth, which is about 38%. So Asia is growing. If you're looking at this, the most months reporting versus the year before, at a phenomenal rate. If you calculate the 12 months of revenue, so you're looking at annual revenues year on year, Again, it's more than doubled in Asia over that time. Our global measure was about 64%. So this shows that, and this, by the way, mirrors very closely what we've seen in other regions that have been later to the streaming economy. So in the US and in continental Europe, streaming services were sort of, in some ways born in those markets, at least the global services were. And we've seen a level of maturity there and a level of growth that looks pretty much like the charts that we've seen now, but is reaching a level of maturity. The extraordinary thing for us, and back to that growth we're seeing, is the growth we're seeing now is not just in the USA and not just in sort of mature European markets. This year, our streaming revenues in Brazil, for example, are going to exceed our streaming revenues in France. And from an independent label perspective, I don't know any independent label other than perhaps some Brazilian independent labels that ever saw a market like that. And it's not just these huge economies like Brazil. We'll make more than $1 million in Peru this year. We're making significant revenues now in Indonesia and Malaysia and Philippines. So the market is growing not only very quickly in the developed markets and bringing a lot of people in, but we're certainly seeing this audio business grow very strongly in all these emerging markets. And these kind of rates of growth that I showed you in the last couple of slides that we're seeing across all of the Asian markets point to the fact that this is not going to stop. And this acceleration of growth and this adoption by consumers of these platforms for Asian rights holders presents enormous opportunities, not only in their own markets where the value of the market is increasing. And I think those of you who were in Will Page's presentation yesterday from Spotify would have seen a chart showing rates of growth across the Asian regions, which are mirroring again what we saw once streaming got to a level of maturity in the bigger markets. So as an entrepreneur working in this market, working with artists in this market, looking for where your audience is, there's all of a sudden an increase in the amount of value within your own market, which I think is a particularly exciting development. But what we're also seeing is there's a global marketplace opening to people. So what we did, every year we survey these thousands of labels that we represent around the world, and we try and get a snapshot of what their business looks like in the digital world versus the download world and all sorts of other markets. And this, I think, is a real illustration of why operating now in the digital market is a whole new paradigm that we really need from a rights holder perspective, from a label perspective, to really try and start to understand and harness to our advantage. So what we asked our members is, how many of you in the physical market make more money outside your own country than inside your country? And how does that work in the digital space? So in the digital space, how many of you make more money outside your home country than inside your home country? And as you can see in the physical market over 2 years, people said, 16 to 17% of people said in the physical market they actually collected more money, made more revenue outside their home market than inside the home market. In the digital space, it went from 39 to 42% last year. So significantly higher number of people are now operating in a marketplace where majority of your business is coming from outside your own market. And this is not English language labels only. This is as I said, this is a set of labels from 53 countries around the world who are fundamentally seeing the shape of their business change. And I think that's a really important factor to consider when, developing a business or launching a business in whatever market you're in now. Being outward facing as opposed to inward facing is becoming increasingly important. Using the data that comes out of these services to get you to understand where and how your music's getting played, where you should be putting your attention, and where and how you can harness that to your advantage and where you should be putting your efforts and activities really, I think opens up a whole range of opportunities that I don't think yet we really fully understand, but I think are clearly exciting when you combine this factor with the revenue growth factor and the adoption of audio streaming services around the world. It feels like for those people who are leaning into the business, who are really trying to understand what the business looks like in 5 and 10 years' time and are building their businesses around that, are the ones that are going to succeed. And I think, as I said, that the most successful labels inside our world have quickly realized that you need to really build your entire strategy now around what's happening to your music on all of these platforms. Where is it being consumed? How does it work? Who's listening to it and where? And how does that all fall together? So to illustrate what that actually means, digging down to an artist level, we took 2 case studies and looked at 2 different labels from 2 different countries within this region to look at what's happening to their music in the audio streaming space. So on the left, there was a company from Japan. 60% of their streaming activity is outside of their own market. So if you think about the Japanese market, which is a very, very Japanese language focused, very domestically focused market, most of the activity for this label is coming from outside of their own market. And if you look at where that's happening, there's a truly global marketplace there. North America, of course, as the most mature streaming market, is a huge part of that, and it has a big Japanese population. The other territories that I think surprise us is Latin America. So almost 20% of their consumption is coming from Latin America, which I think from talking to Japanese labels is not what they expect. On the right, we have a label that's from India. And this label is from India, and 85% of their streaming, at least in our world, comes from outside their own territory. But I also think there's a factor in there in that the global services are yet to make a real impact in that market, and we've really only got one deal that's active in the Indian market. But again, if you look at the consumption of the music on a global basis, there's truly a global marketplace available to those labels. And you have a real sense, I think, looking at this, that there's not, even if you're singing in your own language, in your own market, and predominantly targeting your local populace, the opportunities there are phenomenal. But video remains a challenge, and I think we've been very vocal in the past about the fact that the consumption economy is what we're really in now. We're encouraging people to consume our music. We're not selling pieces anymore. And the fact is, in this region in particular, the #1 point of consumption of music is video streaming. Yet from a revenue perspective, it's definitely not the #1 point of revenue that's coming into our businesses. So if I look at the overall Merlin business on a global basis, our audio business in the last 12 months is growing at 3 times the rate of our video revenues. So if you picture that, the entry of audio streaming businesses into our audio streaming services into our business is increasing 3 times faster than our video revenues. Yet I don't think that's the case in terms of the actual consumption of music. So I think finding ways that we can start harnessing video services to become more central to the revenue and encouraging them to actually remunerate us a way that's more in line with what we're seeing on the audio services. If we get to that point, then I think there's another huge upturn in our business in the future in terms of where we'll see revenues come from. And just quickly, the chart on the right illustrates this, the reality of this from a label perspective. So again, I think we would pretty much look at our entire base of membership and see that the majority of the consumption of their music comes from video streaming. Yet something like 82% of them are making less than a quarter of their revenue from video streaming. And there's something not quite right with that picture. So for all of the positivity we've seen about the growth and the regionalisation and the internationalisation of the marketplace to people in terms of the consumption economy, there's a real challenge, I think, in terms of where and how video sits in our business, and I think strategically that's a big question for all of us in terms of how these markets develop. And I finish, as I always will, with the survey that we have our members filled in, where a lot of these numbers came from. In this market of change, and despite the challenges we're having, and despite the fact that our industry is in flux and downloads are reducing, 85% of our people that are our members tell us that they're optimistic about the future in this survey. And I think it's easy to see why the optimism is there. You know, as independents, if we're forward-facing, creative, entrepreneurial, and really digitally focused, there's a massive future for us. We're really excited to see the trends in this region in particular and where that's heading for the labels we represent in these markets, but also for the international labels that we represent in the global marketplace. I hope that optimism permeates the room and you go off and do incredible things this year. I'm going to leave you to the rest of the panels. Thank you for your time and thanks. Bye.